Welcome to Boring Nightmares, where we explore the most unbelievable missing persons cases that have baffled investigators and left families searching for answers. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest investigations into these mysterious disappearances. Now let's dive into today's incredible case. It was June 12th, 1985. The sun was just breaking through the thick canopy of pine trees when 13-year-old Michael Patterson adjusted his backpack straps and looked up at his troop leader with eager anticipation. The air was crisp and clean in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, carrying the scent of moss and damp earth that only comes from ancient forests. For Michael, this hiking trip with Boy Scout Troop 427 was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. He'd been looking forward to it for months, practicing his knots, studying his wilderness survival handbook, and dreaming of earning his hiking merit badge. But somewhere between the morning departure and the setting sun, something went terribly wrong. By nightfall, Michael Patterson had vanished without a trace. No footprints leading away from the campsite. No torn clothing caught on branches. No calls for help echoing through the valleys. Just silence, as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. For 7 years, his disappearance would haunt his family, his community, and the investigators who refused to give up hope. Search teams combed every inch of the surrounding wilderness. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that led nowhere. Helicopters circled overhead for days, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. But Michael was gone. The case grew cold. Files were marked inactive. The Boy Scout troop disbanded. Michael's parents, David and Susan Patterson, never stopped believing their son was out there somewhere, alive or otherwise. They organized their own search parties every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. They posted flyers in every town within a 100-mile radius. They never moved from their house in Bellingham, just in case Michael somehow found his way home. 7 years passed. 7 long years of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was June 15th, 1992, exactly 7 years and 3 days after Michael vanished. Cave explorer and geology professor Dr. Sarah Manning was conducting research in a previously unmapped section of the Olympic Mountains when her team discovered something that would send shockwaves through the entire Pacific Northwest. Deep underground, in a limestone cave system that had been sealed for decades, they found evidence that would finally provide answers to one of Washington State's most baffling missing person cases. What they discovered in that cave wasn't just closure for the Patterson family. It was proof that sometimes the most innocent adventures can lead to the darkest of secrets. And what happened to Michael Patterson in those mountains 7 years earlier was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The truth had been waiting in the darkness all along, preserved in stone and silence, ready to reveal a story that would make you question everything you thought you knew about the wilderness and the dangers that lurk beneath its surface. This is the story of Michael Patterson's disappearance and the shocking discovery that finally brought him home. It begins on what should have been a perfect summer day in 1985, when a group of excited young boys set off into the mountains with their trusted leaders, completely unaware that they were walking toward a mystery that would grip an entire region for nearly a decade What really happened on that hiking trail? Why did Michael wander away from his group? And what secrets were hidden in that cave for 7 long years? The morning of June 12th, 1985, started like any other scout outing. Troop 427 had been planning this 3-day wilderness adventure for months. The destination was a well-established campground in the Olympic National Forest, a place where countless scout troops had safely hiked and camped for decades. 22 boys, ranging in age from 11 to 16, had gathered at the trailhead along with their 4 adult leaders, Scoutmaster Robert Harrison, Assistant Scoutmaster Tom Bradley, and parent volunteers Jim Walsh and Carl Stevens. These weren't inexperienced hikers. Harrison had been leading scout trips for over 15 years. The trail they chose was marked, well-maintained, and considered appropriate for intermediate hikers. Michael Patterson was one of the younger members of the group, but he wasn't the youngest. At 13, he was an enthusiastic scout who had already earned 12 merit badges. His parents described him as responsible, outdoorsy, and someone who followed rules. He wasn't the type of kid to wander off on his own. Michael had been camping with the troop multiple times before, and he knew the basic safety protocols. Stay with your buddy. Don't leave the designated areas without permission. Always inform an adult if you're going anywhere, even to use the bathroom. These weren't suggestions in Troop 427. They were absolute rules that had been drilled into every scout from their very first meeting. The hike to their campsite was supposed to take about 4 hours, covering roughly 8 miles of moderate terrain. The weather was perfect, temperatures in the mid-70s with clear skies and light breeze. The boys were in high spirits, joking and talking as they made their way along the trail. Michael was walking with his buddy, 15-year-old Danny Rivera, near the middle of the group. According to the other scouts, there was nothing unusual about Michael's behavior that morning. He seemed excited, maybe a little tired from the hike, but nothing that raised any red flags. The first sign that something was wrong came around 2 in the afternoon. The troop had stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook about 6 miles into their hike. The boys spread out to eat their sandwiches and rest their feet, staying within sight of the adults as instructed. Scoutmaster Harrison conducted a head count, as was his standard practice at every stop. 21 boys. Michael Patterson was missing. Danny Rivera was the first to notice his hiking buddy wasn't among the group. He told Harrison that Michael had been right behind him when they reached the overlook, but when Danny turned around to share a granola bar, Michael was gone. What happened next was a textbook search and rescue response. Harrison immediately assigned 2 adults to stay with the remaining scouts while he and Tom Bradley began searching the immediate area, calling Michael's name and checking every possible location where a boy might have wandered. They searched for 2 hours, expanding their perimeter gradually before Harrison made the decision to hike back to the road and contact the authorities. By 6 p.m., the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department had dispatched their search and rescue team. By nightfall, over 50 volunteers were combing the forest with flashlights and emergency radios. The initial search was massive and methodical. Search dogs were brought in within 12 hours. The Washington State Patrol provided helicopter support. Emergency volunteers from 6 different counties joined the effort. For the first 72 hours, searchers operated under the assumption that Michael was lost but alive, possibly injured and waiting for rescue. The terrain around the trail was challenging, but not impossibly dangerous. There were no major cliff faces or rapidly flowing rivers in the immediate area. If Michael had simply gotten turned around and lost his way, experienced searchers should have been able to find him relatively quickly. But as the hours turned into days and the days turned into weeks, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't a typical lost hiker situation. Oh, Michael Patterson had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. His footprints disappeared at the lunch spot where he was last seen. No piece of clothing or equipment was ever found, despite searches that covered hundreds of square miles. No witness ever came forward claiming to have seen a boy matching Michael's description. The forest had simply swallowed him whole, leaving behind no trace and no clues. The impact on the community was devastating. Michael wasn't just any missing child, he was a local boy from a well-known family. His father, David, owned a successful hardware store in downtown Bellingham. His mother, Susan, taught third grade at the elementary school that many of the other Scout family's children attended. The Pattersons were active in their church, involved in community activities, and known throughout the area as good, honest people. When their son vanished, it felt like it could have happened to anyone's child. Parents started questioning whether outdoor activities were safe. Scout enrollment in the region dropped dramatically. The investigators pulled every thread they could find. They interviewed Michael's friends and family members multiple times, searching for any clue that might explain his behavior that morning. They questioned the other boys in the troop, hoping someone had seen something, heard something, anything that could point them in the right direction. But every lead turned cold. Every witness account only confirmed what they already knew. Michael had been there one moment and gone the next. 3 weeks into the search, a ranger discovered a piece of fabric caught on a branch nearly 4 miles from the lunch site. It was the same green color as the Boy Scout uniform shirts, and for a brief moment, hope flared in the hearts of Michael's parents. But laboratory testing revealed it wasn't from Michael's shirt at all. It was from a different manufacturer, a different fabric blend. Another dead end in a case that seemed to specialize in them. The terrain where Michael disappeared was particularly challenging. The Cascade Mountains in that region were known for their dense forests, steep ravines, and countless places where a person could disappear without a trace. There were old mining claims scattered throughout the area, abandoned cabins that hunters sometimes used, and dozens of small caves and rock formations that could provide shelter or hide evidence. Search teams investigated every single one they could find, but the wilderness seemed to have swallowed Michael Patterson as completely as if he had never existed. As autumn approached and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, the official search was scaled back. The harsh reality was that resources were limited, and with no new leads emerging, authorities had to prioritize active cases where there was still hope of finding someone alive. The Patterson family refused to accept this decision. David Patterson took an extended leave of absence from his hardware store, spending every weekend in the mountains, following hiking trails and exploring areas that the official search teams hadn't covered. Susan Patterson organized volunteer search parties that continued throughout the winter months. They put up missing person posters in every town within a 100-mile radius, placed advertisements in newspapers across the Pacific Northwest, and contacted every Boy Scout troop in Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California. They held fundraisers to pay for private search dogs and hired a helicopter pilot to conduct aerial surveys of the most remote areas. The community rallied around them, but as winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, the searches became less frequent, the volunteers fewer, and the media attention faded. By the first anniversary of Michael's disappearance, the case had become a local legend. People in Bellingham would point out the Patterson house to visitors, lowering their voices as they told the story of the boy who vanished without a trace. Some developed their own theories about what had happened. Perhaps Michael had been attacked by a bear or mountain lion, and his body had been dragged so far into the wilderness that it would never be found. Others suggested he might have fallen into one of the many deep ravines in the area, his body hidden beneath fallen logs and debris. There were darker theories too. The Olympic Mountains had a history of transient populations, drifters, and hermits who lived off the grid in makeshift camps deep in the forest. Some people whispered that Michael might have encountered someone dangerous, someone who had reasons for avoiding contact with civilization. But these theories were never substantiated, and without evidence, they remained nothing more than speculation. David and Susan Patterson never gave up hope, but the strain was taking its toll. Their marriage, once strong and supportive, began to show cracks under the pressure of their unending grief. Susan blamed herself for letting Michael go on the trip. David blamed himself for not teaching his son better wilderness survival skills. They attended support groups for families of missing children, but nothing could fill the Michael-shaped hole in their lives. The Patterson house became a shrine to their missing son. Michael's room remained exactly as he had left it the morning of the camping trip. His Boy Scout handbook sat open on his desk to the page about orienteering. His hiking boots were still by the front door, waiting for feet that would never fill them again. Every phone call made their hearts race, hoping it might be news about their son. Every knock on the door brought the possibility that this might be the day they finally got answers. Years passed. Michael would have graduated from high school, gone to college, perhaps started a family of his own. But for David and Susan Patterson, he remained frozen in time, 13 years old forever, lost somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Olympic Mountains. They marked each anniversary of his disappearance with a memorial service at their church, and every year, fewer people attended. The community had moved on, but the Pattersons couldn't, wouldn't, shouldn't. The detectives assigned to Michael's case changed several times over the years. Some retired, others transferred to different departments, and each new investigator would review the file, interview the family, and ultimately reach the same conclusion as their predecessors. There simply wasn't enough evidence to determine what had happened to Michael Patterson. The case remained open, but it was no longer actively investigated. It sat in a filing cabinet, gathering dust, one of thousands of unsolved disappearances that haunt families across America. Then came that phone call in 1992. Dr. Sarah Manning had been exploring caves for 23 years, but she had never felt the chill that ran down her spine when her headlamp illuminated what lay scattered across the limestone floor of the hidden chamber. It was June 15th, 1992, and what should have been a routine geological survey in the remote reaches of the Olympic Mountains had just become something far more sinister. The cave system they'd discovered was pristine, untouched by human presence for what appeared to be decades. The entrance had been concealed by a rock slide, probably triggered by the same earthquake that had shaken the region back in the early 80s. But now, as Dr. Manning and her three-person team carefully made their way through the winding passages, they were finding evidence that someone had been here before them, someone who had never left. The first sign was a piece of fabric, green and faded, caught on a jagged outcropping about 200 feet from the main entrance. Dr. Manning's assistant, geologist Mark Chen, had spotted it during their initial survey. At first, they'd assumed it was debris from a previous expedition, perhaps left by hunters or recreational cavers who had accessed the system before the rock slide. But as they ventured deeper into the cave, following a passage that wound steadily downward into the mountain's core, they began to find other items: a waterlogged compass, a tarnished whistle on a braided lanyard, and then, in a chamber roughly the size of a school classroom, they found something that made Dr. Manning's breath catch in her throat. It was a Boy Scout handbook, its pages yellowed and brittle with age and moisture. The cover was partially torn, but the distinctive logo was still visible. Dr. Manning carefully picked it up, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she opened to the first page. Written in faded blue ink, in the careful handwriting of a 13-year-old boy, was a name that would soon send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. Michael Patterson, Troop 427, and beneath that, a date that made the significance of their discovery undeniable: June 12th, 1985. Mark Chen was examining something else across the chamber, his voice tight with apprehension as he called out to the team leader. Dr. Manning approached slowly, dreading what she might see. There, partially concealed beneath a thin layer of limestone sediment that had accumulated over the years, were unmistakably human remains. Not complete, but enough to confirm what the handbook had already suggested. They had found the final resting place of Michael Patterson, the Boy Scout who had vanished without a trace 7 years earlier, whose disappearance had captivated and terrified an entire region. But as Dr. Manning surveyed the scene more carefully, using her geological training to piece together what had happened in this underground tomb, she began to realize that Michael's story was far more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined. The positioning of the remains suggested that Michael had survived the initial fall or descent into the cave system. There were clear signs that he had moved around the chamber, had attempted to find a way out. Food wrappers, definitely not from 1985 based on the packaging, were scattered near what appeared to have been a makeshift sleeping area. Someone had been bringing supplies to this cave, feeding someone who was trapped here, keeping them alive for reasons that Dr. Manning couldn't begin to fathom. The most chilling discovery came when Chen found what appeared to be a journal wrapped in a plastic bag and hidden in a crevice near the chamber's far wall. The handwriting was different from what they'd seen in the Boy Scout handbook, more mature, more desperate. The entries were dated sporadically over a period of several months, beginning in July 1985 and ending abruptly in October of that same year. As Dr. Manning read the first few pages by the light of her headlamp, a horrifying picture began to emerge of what had really happened to Michael Patterson during those final months of his life. The journal revealed that Michael hadn't simply gotten lost during the scout trip. According to the entries, he had been deliberately lured away from his group by someone he initially trusted, someone who knew about the cave system and had been using it for purposes that became increasingly clear as Dr. Manning continued reading. The handwriting spoke of being kept prisoner, of being told that his family thought he was dead, of being threatened with violence if he tried to escape. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the references to other children, other young people who had supposedly met similar fates in these underground chambers. Chen had found additional evidence to support the journal's claims. In a side passage that branched off from the main chamber, they discovered more personal items. A girl's hair ribbon, a pair of small sneakers that clearly hadn't belonged to Michael, a set of car keys with a keychain that bore the logo of a local high school. Each item told a story of another young person who had disappeared, whose fate had remained unknown until this moment. Dr. Manning realized they weren't just looking at the scene of Michael Patterson's death. They were looking at what appeared to be a serial predator's dumping ground, a place where multiple victims had been brought over the years. The geological evidence supported a timeline that was almost too horrible to contemplate. The cave system showed signs of regular human activity dating back at least a decade before Michael's disappearance. Someone had been using these chambers for years, had developed a system for accessing them, despite the difficult terrain and concealed entrance. The limestone formations showed wear patterns consistent with repeated passage. Tool marks on the walls suggested that someone had worked to expand certain passages, making it easier to transport unwilling victims into the depths of the mountain. As Dr. Manning's team carefully documented their findings, preparing to contact law enforcement, they made one final discovery that would haunt their dreams for years to come. In the deepest part of the cave system, nearly a quarter-mile from the entrance, they found a chamber that appeared to have been deliberately modified. The walls had been carved with strange symbols, some appearing to be crude calendars or counting systems. And scattered throughout this final room were the remains of what appeared to be at least 6 more individuals, all showing signs of having been very young when they died. The implications were staggering. For years, someone had been abducting children and young people from across the region, bringing them to this remote cave system and keeping them prisoner in conditions that defied human comprehension. Michael Patterson hadn't been a random victim of a hiking accident. He had been specifically targeted, deliberately isolated from his scout group, and then subjected to months of captivity before finally succumbing to the horrific conditions in which he was being held. Dr. Manning's hands shook as she placed the final emergency call to authorities, knowing that her discovery would reopen not just the Michael Patterson case, but potentially dozens of other missing persons investigations from across the Pacific Northwest. The cave had given up its secrets, but those secrets revealed a darkness that no one had been prepared to confront. The boy who had vanished on what should have been a simple scout hiking trip had instead become the victim of something far more sinister, something that had been operating in the shadows of the Olympic Mountains for years. As the sun set on June 15, 1992, emergency vehicles began the long, difficult journey to the remote cave entrance. Dr. Manning waited at the site, guarding the evidence that would finally bring answers to families who had been searching for their missing children for years. But she knew that those answers would bring little comfort. The truth about what had happened to Michael Patterson and the others was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The wilderness had indeed swallowed them whole, but not in the way their families had believed. They had been fed to the darkness by human hands, kept alive just long enough to understand the true horror of their situation. The phone call that David and Susan Patterson received that evening would end 7 years of desperate searching, but it would also begin a new kind of nightmare. Their son had been found, but the circumstances of his discovery would force them to confront the reality that Michael's disappearance had never been an accident. He had been the victim of a predator who had used the vast wilderness of the Olympic Mountains as his hunting ground, someone who had turned the natural beauty and isolation of the region into something monstrous. The shadows were growing longer when Sheriff's investigator Paul Chen approached the cave entrance with his team of forensic specialists. 2 hours had passed since Dr. Manning's initial call, and every minute had been spent preparing for what could only be described as the most complex crime scene in Olympic Mountains history. Chen had worked homicide investigations for nearly 20 years, but he'd never encountered anything quite like this. The remote location, the multiple victims, and the evidence of prolonged captivity painted a picture that defied every standard protocol he'd ever learned. The entrance to the cave system was barely visible, hidden behind fallen boulders and decades of undergrowth. According to Dr. Manning's team, the opening had been sealed by a rock slide sometime in the early 1980s, creating a natural tomb that had preserved evidence in ways that outdoor crime scenes never could. As Chen's flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the first chamber, he could already see why this case would rewrite the textbooks on cold case investigations. The limestone formations inside the cave told their own story. Tool marks on the walls showed clear evidence of human modification, areas where someone had deliberately expanded passages to make movement easier. This wasn't the work of casual explorers or recreational cavers. Someone had turned this natural cave system into something much darker, a carefully planned prison that could hold multiple victims in conditions that guaranteed they would never be found. Chen's crime scene photographer, Maria Santos, worked methodically through each chamber, documenting everything before the forensic team could begin their detailed examination. The photos would later show what appeared to be a sophisticated operation that had been running for years before Michael Patterson's disappearance. Multiple sleeping areas, rudimentary sanitation facilities, and evidence of long-term food storage suggested that whoever was responsible for this had been using the cave system as a base of operations for kidnapping and imprisoning victims from across the Pacific Northwest. In the main chamber, where Michael's remains had been discovered, Chen found evidence that chilled him to the bone. Personal items from other victims were carefully arranged in what appeared to be trophies. A girl's jewelry box from the 1970s, a pair of children's glasses that had clearly belonged to someone much younger than Michael, a wallet containing identification for a teenage boy who had disappeared from Portland in 1983. Each item told the story of another family who had never gotten answers another missing person case that was about to be solved in the most horrific way possible. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, began the painstaking work of cataloging the remains scattered throughout the cave system. Her preliminary examination suggested that at least 8 different individuals had died in these chambers over a period spanning nearly 15 years. The positioning of the bones and the condition of the remains told a story of systematic abuse and murder that made Michael Patterson's case just one chapter in a much larger and more terrifying narrative. But it was the discovery in the deepest chamber that would provide the key to understanding the full scope of the crimes. There, carved into the limestone wall, were detailed records kept by the perpetrator, names, dates, descriptions of victims, and most chillingly, notes about their families and the searches that had been conducted for them. The killer had not only been taking victims, he had been following the investigations, studying the techniques used by law enforcement, and adapting his methods to avoid detection. Chen read the carved entries with growing horror. The first entry was dated 1978, describing the abduction of a teenage girl from a hiking trail near Mount Rainier. The last entry was dated October 1985, just 4 months after Michael Patterson's disappearance. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that Michael had been tortured for months before finally dying in these underground chambers. The investigation team worked through the night, carefully removing evidence and preparing the remains for transport to the state crime lab. Each discovery raised new questions about how such an extensive criminal operation could have gone undetected for so long. The cave system was remote, but not impossibly so. Someone would have needed regular access to bring supplies, dispose of evidence, and transport victims to the site. This suggested either remarkable planning and preparation, or possibly the involvement of someone with intimate knowledge of the area. Dr. Walsh's examination of the remains revealed disturbing patterns. Many of the victims showed evidence of prolonged malnutrition and physical trauma consistent with being held in captivity for extended periods. Some had clearly been children when they were taken, their growth patterns showing the effects of inadequate nutrition and extreme stress. Others appeared to have been teenagers or young adults taken during what should have been routine outdoor activities. The cache of personal belongings found throughout the cave provided investigators with a roadmap to unsolved cases spanning the entire Pacific Northwest. A Boy Scout handbook from a different troop than Michael's. Hiking equipment that matched descriptions from missing person reports filed in 3 different states. A distinctive piece of jewelry that would eventually be matched to a college student who had vanished while backpacking in the Cascades in 1981. As dawn broke over the Olympic Mountains, Chen and his team began to understand the true magnitude of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just the solution to Michael Patterson's disappearance. It was evidence of what appeared to be one of the most prolific serial killers in Pacific Northwest history, someone who had used the vast wilderness and cave systems of the region to hide a killing spree that had lasted for nearly a decade. The investigation would eventually expand to include law enforcement agencies from 4 states. Missing person cases that had been filed away as presumed accidents or random disappearances were suddenly viewed through the lens of a coordinated predator who had been hunting in the wilderness for years. Families who had given up hope of ever learning what happened to their loved ones would finally get answers, though those answers would be more horrific than anything they had imagined. The cave system itself became the subject of intensive study by both law enforcement and criminal psychology experts. The level of planning and preparation required to create such an operation suggested someone with extensive outdoor experience, possibly military or survival training. The remote location and sophisticated concealment methods indicated intimate knowledge of the area, suggesting the perpetrator was likely someone who lived in the region and had been using the wilderness for criminal purposes for an extended period. Back in Bellingham, David and Susan Patterson received the call they had been waiting for 7 years to receive. Their son had been found, but the circumstances of his discovery would force them to confront a reality more terrible than they had ever imagined. Michael hadn't simply gotten lost during a scout hike. He had been targeted, abducted, and subjected to months of captivity before finally dying in conditions that no parent should ever have to contemplate. The news media descended on the Olympic Peninsula as word of the discovery spread. What had started as the search for one missing Boy Scout had uncovered evidence of a serial killer whose crimes had gone undetected for nearly a decade. The story would dominate headlines for months as investigators worked to identify the remaining victims and piece together the full scope of the criminal operation. Dr. Manning's geological survey, which should have been routine academic research, had instead uncovered one of the most significant criminal discoveries in the region's history. The cave system that had hidden these secrets for so long was now the center of a massive investigation that would eventually connect dozens of unsolved missing person cases from across the Pacific Northwest. The forensic evidence would eventually lead investigators to develop a profile of their suspect. Someone with extensive outdoor skills, intimate knowledge of the Olympic Mountains cave systems, and the ability to move freely through the wilderness without attracting attention. Someone who had been operating in the shadows for years, using the natural isolation of the region to hide crimes that defied comprehension. But perhaps most chilling of all was the realization that whoever was responsible for these crimes had simply vanished after October 1985. The carved records in the cave ended abruptly with Michael Patterson's death, suggesting that the perpetrator had either died, moved to a different area, or found new methods for disposing of victims that didn't require the cave system. This meant that somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, a killer might still be alive, still free, and possibly still hunting. The investigation into the cave discoveries would continue for years, with new evidence periodically surfacing as forensic techniques improved and additional cave systems in the area were explored. Each new piece of evidence would add another chapter to a story that had started with a simple Boy Scout hiking trip and ended with the exposure of one of the region's darkest secrets. A story for the families of the victims. The discovery brought both closure and new anguish. They finally knew what had happened to their loved ones, but they also had to confront the reality that their children had suffered in ways that no parent should ever have to imagine. The cave had given up its secrets, but those secrets would haunt everyone who learned them for the rest of their lives. The Olympic Mountains, once seen as a place of natural beauty and outdoor adventure, would forever be associated with this horrific discovery. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the dust motes, dancing in the air of the sealed chamber, the true magnitude of what they had uncovered began to reveal itself. The investigation team, led by Detective Chen, had spent the entire night carefully cataloging evidence, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to discover in the deepest recesses of the cave system. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Walsh, made a discovery that would forever change how law enforcement viewed this case. In a chamber that required crawling through a passage, barely wide enough for an adult, she found what appeared to be a workshop of sorts. The walls were lined with makeshift shelves carved into the rock, each holding items that told a story of calculated horror. Tools for restraint, modified camping equipment, and most chillingly, detailed journals written in a cramped, methodical handwriting that documented years of planning and preparation. The journals revealed the disturbing truth about the perpetrator's methodology. He hadn't been selecting victims randomly. Each entry described months of surveillance, studying hiking patterns, learning the schedules of scout troops and outdoor recreation groups. He had infiltrated online forums dedicated to hiking and camping, gathering information about upcoming trips and vulnerable targets. The level of preparation was staggering, suggesting someone with extensive outdoor experience and an intimate knowledge of the region's cave systems. Detective Chen found evidence that the killer had been using multiple caves throughout the Olympic Mountains, creating a network of hidden chambers where he could transport and hold victims. Maps found in the workshop showed at least 6 other locations, all connected by little-known mining trails and abandoned logging roads. Each site had been carefully selected for its remoteness and the difficulty rescuers would face in accessing it. The most horrifying discovery came when Dr. Walsh found what appeared to be a primitive darkroom, complete with chemical baths and developing equipment. Photographs hung from makeshift clotheslines, images that documented the killer's crimes in graphic detail. The pictures showed victims in various stages of captivity, some clearly taken over extended periods. Michael Patterson appeared in dozens of photographs, chronicling his deterioration from a healthy 13-year-old boy to the skeletal remains that had been discovered months later. But perhaps most disturbing were the photographs of other victims, children, and young adults whose disappearances had never been solved. A girl who appeared to be around 16, wearing what looked like a high school cheerleading uniform. A young man in hiking gear who seemed to be pleading with the camera. Each photograph was meticulously labeled with dates and locations, creating a timeline of horror that stretched back nearly 2 decades. The evidence suggested that Michael Patterson had been one of the killer's last victims. The journals indicated that by 1985, the perpetrator was becoming increasingly paranoid about detection. The last entry, dated just days after Michael's death, described his decision to abandon the cave system and move to a new hunting ground. As the investigation expanded, law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest began reopening cold cases that matched the killer's profile. Missing hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts who had vanished over the past 20 years were suddenly viewed through the lens of a coordinated predator operation. The scope of the crimes was staggering, with potential victims numbering in the dozens. The photographic evidence led to a breakthrough in identifying additional victims. Families who had been searching for missing loved ones for years finally had answers, though those answers brought little comfort. Parents who had clung to hope that their children might still be alive somewhere were forced to confront the reality that they had been dead for years, victims of a monster who had used the wilderness they loved as his hunting ground. The investigation revealed sophisticated planning that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The killer had established supply caches throughout the region, hidden food, water, and equipment that allowed him to remain in the wilderness for extended periods. He had studied weather patterns, knowing when search and rescue operations would be hampered by conditions. He had even monitored police radio frequencies, staying one step ahead of any investigation that might threaten his operations. Dr. Manning's geological expertise proved crucial in understanding the full scope of the cave system. Her analysis revealed that the chambers had been modified over many years, with some excavation work dating back to the early 1970s. The killer had essentially created an underground prison complex, complete with drainage systems to prevent flooding and ventilation shafts to ensure air circulation. The level of engineering involved suggested someone with professional construction or mining experience. The forensic evidence painted a picture of systematic torture and psychological manipulation. Victims had been kept alive for extended periods, subjected to conditions designed to break their will to resist. The killer had studied techniques of psychological coercion, implementing methods that would ensure compliance while maintaining the victim's physical condition for as long as possible. Chemical analysis of the cave environment revealed traces of drugs that had been used to sedate victims during transport and captivity. The killer had access to veterinary tranquilizers and other controlled substances, suggesting connections to medical or veterinary communities. This evidence led investigators to begin examining individuals with access to such materials, narrowing their suspect pool significantly. The workshop contained evidence of the killer's obsession with documentation. Every aspect of his crimes had been recorded in meticulous detail, from initial surveillance notes to final disposal methods. He had created a library of horror that served both as trophies and as a reference guide for refining his techniques. The depth of his record-keeping suggested someone with an academic background or professional training in research methodology. As the evidence mounted, a profile of the perpetrator began to emerge. He was likely a white male in his 30s or 40s during the peak of his activity, someone with extensive outdoor experience and intimate knowledge of the Olympic Mountains region. He had access to vehicles suitable for wilderness travel and the financial resources to maintain his operations over an extended period. Most importantly, he was someone who could move freely through the community without attracting suspicion. The investigation team discovered that the killer had been monitoring news coverage of missing person cases, keeping newspaper clippings and magazine articles about his crimes. He had studied search and rescue techniques, learning how to stay ahead of recovery efforts. Some of his journal entries showed that he had even participated in volunteer search efforts for his own victims, gaining insider knowledge about investigation procedures while maintaining his cover as a concerned community member. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts suggested someone who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as subjects in an ongoing experiment. His writings revealed a detached, clinical approach to torture and murder that indicated severe personality disorders. He showed no remorse for his actions, instead expressing frustration when victims died before he felt he had completed his research. The cave system itself became a crime scene of unprecedented complexity. Forensic teams worked for months to catalog every piece of evidence, using ground-penetrating radar to locate burial sites and hidden chambers. The work was hampered by the remote location and the technical challenges of working in underground environments, but investigators were determined to find every victim and piece of evidence. The discovery led to changes in how outdoor recreation was managed in the region. Park services implemented new safety protocols, requiring registration for backcountry camping and establishing regular check-in procedures for hikers and campers. The case became a study in how predators could exploit the very isolation that made wilderness areas attractive to outdoor enthusiasts. For the families of the victims, the discovery brought a complex mix of relief and renewed grief. They finally had answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but those answers revealed suffering beyond anything they had imagined. Support groups were established to help families cope with the traumatic revelations, and victim advocacy organizations worked to ensure that the families received the resources they needed to heal. The investigation continued for years as law enforcement agencies worked to identify all the victims and determine the full scope of the killer's crimes. Each new piece of evidence led to additional cases being reopened, creating a cascading effect that revealed the true magnitude of the predator's activities. The case became one of the largest serial killer investigations in Pacific Northwest history. The mystery of the killer's identity remained unsolved, however. Despite the wealth of evidence found in the cave system, investigators were unable to match the DNA evidence to any known individual. The perpetrator seemed to have vanished as completely as his victims once had, leaving behind only the horrific legacy of his crimes hidden in the darkness of the Olympic Mountains. The story of Michael Patterson and the other victims serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers that can lurk in even the most beautiful and seemingly safe environments. The wilderness that had provided them with adventure and wonder had also concealed a predator who turned their love of the outdoors against them. Their deaths were not the result of accidents or natural dangers, but of calculated evil that had been hidden in the mountains for decades. As investigators continued their work, they remained hopeful that someday the killer would be identified and brought to justice. The evidence preserved in the cave had given them more information about the perpetrator than they had ever hoped to find. DNA technology continued to advance, and cold case investigators never stopped working to match the evidence to a suspect. The cave system was eventually sealed permanently, both to preserve it as a crime scene and to prevent others from being exposed to the horrors it contained. A memorial was established near the entrance, honoring the victims whose remains had been found and acknowledging those who were still missing. The site became a place of remembrance, where families could come to grieve and remember their loved ones. The impact of the discovery extended far beyond the immediate investigation. Criminologists studied the case as an example of how predators could operate undetected for extended periods in remote areas. The killer's methods were analyzed and shared with law enforcement agencies worldwide, helping to prevent similar crimes and improve investigation techniques. The story of what happened in that cave became a cautionary tale that was shared with outdoor enthusiasts, reminding them of the importance of safety protocols and the need to remain vigilant even in familiar environments. The beautiful wilderness of the Olympic Mountains would never again seem as innocent to those who knew the truth about what had been hidden in its depths. For David and Susan Patterson, the discovery finally provided the closure they had sought for 7 years, though it came at a terrible cost. They learned not only how their son had died, but also that he had suffered in ways no parent should ever have to imagine. The knowledge that Michael had been the victim of such calculated evil was almost harder to bear than the uncertainty they had lived with for so long. The investigation into the Olympic Mountains cave discoveries would continue for years, with new evidence occasionally surfacing and new victims being identified. Each development brought both hope for justice and renewed pain for the families involved. The case became a testament to the persistence of those who refused to give up the search for truth, no matter how long it took or how disturbing that truth might be. The wilderness kept many secrets, but this one had finally been told. The victims had been found, their stories preserved in evidence that would ensure their memory lived on. While justice remained elusive, the truth had finally been brought into the light, offering some measure of peace to those who had waited so long for answers.